You're kneeling on cold stone. It's a June morning in the year 793, and you're a monk on a small tidal island off the coast of England. The morning prayers are half done. Then someone at the door says a word you've never heard used about your home before: ships. You walk outside and see them coming out of the sunrise, low and fast, moving in water so shallow no ship should be able to float there. In about an hour, some of your brothers will be dead. Some will be chained in the bottom of those ships, and Europe will spend the next 250 years asking one question. It's the same question this video is going to answer. What made the Vikings so dangerous? Because here's the thing. It wasn't what you think. It wasn't that they were giants. It wasn't the horned helmets, because those never existed. It wasn't even that they were better fighters, because man for man, they mostly weren't. The real answer is stranger. It's a boat, a business model, and a continent that kept doing the one thing you should never do with a raider. Let's start by clearing out the myth, because the myth is doing a lot of work it didn't earn. The Viking in your head is 7 feet tall, foaming at the mouth, wearing a helmet with horns on it. Almost none of that survives contact with the evidence. Skeletal remains suggest the average Viking man stood somewhere around 5'7", roughly the same as the Englishmen and Franks he was fighting. Well-fed, yes. Strong, sure. A giant, no. The horned helmet doesn't come from history at all. It mostly comes from costume design for a Wagner opera in the 1870s. Actual Viking helmets were plain, round, and practical, because horns on a helmet in a real fight are just handles for your enemy. And the famous berserkers, the warriors who supposedly fought in a howling trance, they show up in sagas written centuries after the fact. And historians still argue about how real, how common, or how drugged they actually were. Every theory you've heard, from mushrooms to ritual frenzy, is speculation stacked on a few lines of old poetry. So the scariest people of the Middle Ages were average-sized part-time farmers in sensible hats. Which makes the question worse, not better. Because these average-sized farmers brought kingdoms to their knees. Charlemagne's empire paid them to go away. England eventually got conquered by them. Twice, depending on how you count. So if it wasn't the men, what was it? The first answer floats. The Viking longship is one of the most quietly perfect machines ever built by hand. Take the Gokstad ship dug out of a Norwegian burial mound. About 76 feet long, built from overlapping oak planks that let the hull flex in heavy seas instead of cracking. It could cross open ocean under sail. And here's the number that changed history. Fully loaded with armed men. A longship needed roughly 3 feet of water to float. 3 feet. About knee-deep on a tall man. Think about what that means. Every other ship in Europe needed a harbor. A longship needed a beach. Any beach. And more importantly, it turned every river in Europe into a highway pointed directly at the interior. The Seine, the Thames, the Loire, the Rhine. Cities that had spent centuries feeling safe because they were miles from the sea suddenly weren't. The longship wasn't just a boat. It was a delivery system. It delivered violence to your doorstep before your king even knew anyone had arrived. And it left before he could do anything about it. If you want to see what that looks like at full scale, watch what happened to Paris. In March of 845, a fleet of 120 longships came up the Seine carrying something like 5,000 men, led by a chieftain the Frankish records call Reginharis, possibly the man behind the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok, though historians hold that identification with 2 fingers and a raised eyebrow. King Charles the Bald split his army onto both banks of the river to stop them. The Vikings simply attacked the smaller half, beat it, and hanged 111 prisoners on an island in the river, where the other half of the army could watch. Then they sailed on to Paris and arrived on Easter Sunday. That timing was not an accident. On Easter Sunday, everything valuable in a Christian city, including the people, is conveniently gathered in one building. Charles looked at his options and chose the one that would haunt Europe for 2 centuries. He paid them to leave. 7,000 pounds of silver and gold, roughly 2.5 metric tons of treasure handed over so the problem would sail away. And it worked. They left, which was exactly the problem, because word travels fast when a king pays out. What Charles had actually done was post a job listing. He'd proven that a few boatloads of Scandinavians could extract half a royal treasury without fighting a single pitched battle for the city. The Franks would end up making around 13 of these payments. And that's when the Viking Age stops being a story about warriors and becomes a story about economics. Here's the reframe most Viking documentaries skip. Raiding wasn't just violence, it was a business model. And like any good business, it had a recurring revenue stream. The English called it what it was, gaffel, tribute. History remembers it as the Danegeld. In 991, after a Viking victory at the Battle of Malden, the English king Ethelred paid 10,000 pounds of silver to make the raiders go away. They went away, counted the money, and came back. In 994, the price was higher. By 1007, it was 36,000 pounds. By 1012, a single payment hit 48,000 pounds of silver, an entire kingdom taxing itself into the ground to pay its own attackers. Over Ethelred's reign, the totals ran into six figures. Archaeologists keep pulling hordes of Anglo-Saxon silver coins out of the ground. In Scandinavia, some of that English silver ended up buried in Swedish farmland by men who never learned a word of English beyond, presumably, same time next year. Ethelred, by the way, is remembered by the nickname The Unready. History can be a little on the nose. Now, up to here, this has been a fun story. Clever boats, bad kings, medieval extortion with a punchline. This is where the fun part ends. Because when the longships pushed off from a burning monastery, silver wasn't the main cargo. People were. The single most valuable thing a Viking raid produced was human beings. The Old Norse word was thrall. When the raiders hit Lindisfarne in 793, the accounts say the older monks were killed and the young ones were carried off, because the young ones could be sold. Over the next 2 centuries, the Vikings built one of the largest slave trading networks in the medieval world. Dublin, the city, the one on the postcards, was founded by Vikings in the 840s, and a major driver of its growth was that it became one of the biggest slave markets in Western Europe. Excavations there and at trading towns like Hedeby and Birka have turned up the hardware, iron collars and shackles, sized for human necks. The network was enormous. Captives from Ireland and England went east. Captives from Slavic lands went south, down the Russian rivers, sold to buyers in the Islamic world, which is a big part of why Viking Age hoards in Sweden are stuffed with tens of thousands of Arabic silver coins. Those coins each represent a transaction, and a lot of those transactions were people. The dramatic image of the Viking Age is an axe. The accurate one is a chain. That's the engine under the whole machine. The ships were the delivery system. The Danegeld was the subscription revenue, and the slave trade was the core product. The violence you've heard about wasn't rage, it was logistics. And it was smart logistics, because here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The Vikings did their homework. They weren't strangers stumbling onto rich targets. Scandinavians had been trading with England and Francia for generations before the raids began. They'd walked the ports. They knew which monasteries were rich, which were defended, and, crucially, they understood the Christian calendar better than some of the Christians. Undefended coastal monasteries, full of gold, staffed by men sworn not to fight, whose treasure all comes out on predictable feast days. To a raider, that's not a target, that's a schedule. Paris on Easter Sunday wasn't luck, it was market research. They even had a tech edge in their hands. Around 170 swords have been found across Europe inlaid with the maker's mark Ulf Bert, and metallurgical analysis shows the best of them were made from crucible steel with a carbon content around 3 times that of ordinary swords of the era. Steel Europe wouldn't produce at scale again until the Industrial Revolution. Where that steel came from is still debated. The leading theory says it traveled up the Volga trade routes from Central Asia or the Middle East, which fits the pattern perfectly. The Vikings didn't invent the best steel of their age. They were plugged into the trade network that could buy it. So, a ship no one could intercept, intelligence no one expected, an economy that rewarded every raid, and victims who kept paying. That's the recipe. Which leaves one last question. If they were this good, why did it ever stop? Two reasons. First, Europe finally stopped making it easy. Charles the Bald's successors fortified bridges across the Seine so fleets couldn't just glide upstream. Alfred the Great, after nearly losing everything to the great heathen army that landed in 865 and swallowed most of England, rebuilt his kingdom around a network of fortified towns called burhs, so that no Viking force could raid deep without a garrison at its back. Raiding stayed possible. It just stopped being cheap. And the Vikings, being businessmen before they were berserkers, responded to the change in margins. Which is the second reason. They took the exit every successful raider dreams of. They went legitimate. In 911, a Viking leader named Rollo cut a deal with the Frankish king. Stop attacking Paris, convert to Christianity, and in exchange, keep a huge chunk of northern France and defend it against other Vikings. That land became Normandy, literally, land of the Northmen. In England, the great heathen armies stopped raiding, settled the whole eastern half of the country, and started farming it. The most dangerous people in Europe didn't get defeated so much as absorbed, with land, titles, and a baptism. Though they got one last word in. In 1066, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, William, crossed the Channel and conquered England. The Norman conquest, the most famous event in English history, was carried out by Vikings who'd spent 5 generations learning French. They never really lost, they just rebranded. So what made the Vikings so dangerous? Not the muscles, not the helmets. A boat that turned rivers into roads, a raid that ran like a business, an intelligence network hiding inside a trade network, and a continent that kept paying the invoice. The lesson got so famous it became a saying. Once you pay the Danegeld, you never get rid of the Dane. We like to think we've moved past all this. Then a hacker locks up a hospital's computers. The hospital quietly wires the ransom, and 3 more hackers pick a hospital. 1,200 years later, the longships are gone. The business model is doing fine.